Further south, a lot of spray and surface water on the roads for the morning commute. Those downpours should ease through the day, but it stays dull and damp for southeast Scotland, northeast England. Elsewhere, a mixture of bright spells, but also some further showers. Again, pretty mild for England and Wales, 15, 16, where we see some sunshine, but a cold-feeling day, particularly that persistent rain over Scotland. Gets pretty cold on Friday night. Many of us will start the weekend with a touch of frost, but also many of us will start with some sunshine. Stays fine for much of eastern England, northern England and Scotland. Further west, cloud will be edging in with some patchy rain. Temperatures in the teens in the south, single figures once more further north, despite some decent spells of sunshine. Goodbye.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Want to be a winner?
You've won £18,000.
I'm flipping heck. I don't know what to say.
Enter our massive spring giveaway with 3 big seasonal prizes to be won. There's £12,345 in tax-free cash to give your finances a spring boost. We'll also send you on a shopping spree with £500 worth of vouchers to spend in the store of your choice. You'll also get a garden gadget package. For another chance to win the vouchers, the treats and £12,345 in tax-free cash, text GBWIN to 84902. Text costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message. Or post your name and number to GB03 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on Friday the 29th of March. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if watching or listening on demand. Good luck.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debate, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. The government's new extremism definition has been unveiled, and it's not without controversy, but it has coincided with Hope Not Hate's annual State of Hate report. My name appears 6 times, also appears on the same page as a neo-Nazi group, not to mention GB News appearing 60 times. But worst of all, this deranged lobby group has been funded by you, the taxpayer. Amidst censure from those defending Diane Abbott's right to speak at Prime Minister's questions yesterday, I will be defending the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, who acted entirely properly and within convention. And is it time to reintroduce wolves into the wild in the UK? Well, it seems to me it's not the best idea ever. However, former Government Environment Advisor Ben Goldsmith has suggested it would be the best way to cull the deer population, and he'll be joining me shortly. Plus, State of the Nation Book Club returns with one of Britain's foremost political journalists. Political editor of the Daily Telegraph, Ben Riley-Smith, will be joining me to discuss his book, The Right to Rule, 13 Years, 5 Prime Ministers and the Implosion of the Tories. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by my most intellectual panel, former Conservative MP and commentator Paul Goodman, and GB News' senior political commentator Nigel Nelson. As always, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's what you've all been waiting for, the news of the day with Sophia Wensler.
Jacob, thank you. Good evening. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB Newsroom. Your top story this hour. The Prime Minister has ruled out holding a general election on the 2nd of May amid speculation he could choose to go to the polls early. In an interview with ITV, Rishi Sunak was asked if there would be an election on the same day as the local elections, which takes place on the 2nd of May. He replied there won't be an election on that day. Previously, he's been reluctant to make definitive statements about the general election, saying only that it's his working assumption it will take place in the second half of the year. Michael Gove has named some of the groups to be investigated under a new definition of extremism, which he says will mean the government can express more clearly than ever who poses a risk to Britain. Some of the groups included are alleged to have Islamist views, with others described as neo-Nazi. Today's new extremism definition will be used to assess whether some groups should be marginalised or blocked from public funding. But Michael Gove insists it's not about silencing those with private and peaceful beliefs.
We have to be clear-eyed about the threat we face, precise about where that threat comes from, and rigorous in defending our democracy. That means upholding freedom of expression, religion and belief when they are threatened, facing down harassment and hate, supporting the communities facing the greatest challenge from extremist activity, and ensuring this House and this country are safe, free and united.
Now, Great Yarmouth MP Brandon Lewis has announced he is standing down as a candidate at the next general election. In a statement posted on X, formerly Twitter, the former Northern Ireland Secretary said, "It has been the greatest honour of my life to represent the people of Great Yarmouth in Parliament." In other news, Russia has been accused of disrupting the GPS signal on the Defence Secretary's plane en route to Poland. The incident occurred as the RAF jet flew close to the edge of Kaliningrad. GPS navigation and internet access was lost for around 30 minutes during the flight, but the pilots have confirmed the aircraft was never at risk. And the Prince of Wales has expressed concerns about the amount of time children spend on phones as he's visited a youth club today. The Prince asked some of the children how long they spend on their phones, with one girl saying she spends up to 15 hours a day. The future king said grown-ups were also guilty of excessive screen time and said we've all got to get better at managing it. He also poked fun at his apparent lack of artistic skill as he took part in some biscuit decorating, saying that his wife is the arty one. And for the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's back to Jacob.
Michael Gove today unveiled the government's new official definition of non-violent extremism. It states, extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance that aims to negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of others, undermine, overturn or replace the UK's system of liberal parliamentary democracy and democratic rights, or intentionally create a permissive environment for others to achieve the results in one or two. Groups that meet this definition will be blocked from receiving government funding and meeting officials. Extremism used to be understood to mean violence to advance your political cause through violence and not through debate. Non-violent extremism, however, is a nebulous rhetorical flourish. It's hazy, indistinct, open to widely different interpretations, and is dangerous as the basis of legislation. Freedom, rights and responsibilities are not absolutes. Curtailing freedom in one area enables it in another and vice versa. Freedom for the wolves means death for the lambs, as Isaiah Berlin put it. A 2016 Channel 4 News poll found that half of British Muslims think homosexuality should be illegal. This would appear to meet the criteria as defined by the government of non-violent extremism, as such a view negates the freedoms of others or creates a permissive environment for others to do so. Now, making homosexuality illegal is a view I disagree with, but it would not be desirable or workable to ban half of British Muslims from interaction with the government. We could no longer call Britain a democracy if we did so. In a democracy, how we relate to each other has to be put through, at times, difficult process of deliberation and debate. Unfortunately, it's not how many of those on the left see things. Today, an influential advocacy group called Hope Not Hate issued a release called State of Hate 2024. Front and centre of the report, however, are not fascists who are pushed right to the back, but elected members of Parliament. I'm in there, as are my fellow MPs, Miriam Cates, Danny Kruger, Marco Longhi and others. The Conservative media comes under attack. The very mild-mannered Spectator, as well as the Daily Telegraph, are there, as well as GBNews, which is mentioned over 60 times. Even the Prime Minister questioning Labour policy is suggested to be evidence of a radical right drift, which is perhaps not surprising, given one of their directors is a Labour peer. Hope Not Hate says that it is non-partisan, that it is anti-fascist, and that they defend, champion and promote democracy and the rule of law, speaking against anti-democratic and authoritarian forces and policies. Under this fake posturing, it receives government funding. The Home Office's counter-extremism unit, in fact, has given them over £100,000 over the last few years. Not only that, but they've received a similar sum from Trust for London. Trust for London manages Church of England trusts, ostensibly there for the maintenance of church buildings. It also administers a trust set up for poverty relief with a £10 million grant from the government after the abolition of the Greater London Council. As you see, institutional capture is unfortunately how too much of the left operates. They will take advantage of the good faith of their opponents to smear and silence those with whom they do not agree. It has happened with Hope Not Hate and the rest of the quangocracy that Sir Keir Starmer intends to expand. It has happened with the civil service. It has happened with the Church of England. It's even happened to some degree with the armed forces. And unfortunately, it's at risk of happening again with standards of this kind that have been announced today, despite the good intentions that may be behind it. As ever, let me know your thoughts, mailmog@gbnews.com. And I'm joined now by Sean Irish, spokesman Just Stop Oil, my panel, the former Conservative MP and commentator, Paul Goodman, and GB News' senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson. Now, Sean, we're both a bit worried that we may agree on this definition of extremism, stopping your group, Just Stop Oil, doing things that are legitimate protest.
Certainly. Well, it's not surprising that the government have taken this stance. I mean, Tory policy has been written by the Daily Mail and GB News, and now it's come back to bite yous. You know, it's quite clear what GB News and the Daily Mail have been saying for months and not years, that protest needs to be squashed, that democratic, you cannot express yourself in a democratic matter if it's not the way GB News likes to do it. So this, it's not surprising. It's just, upset now that it's come back to get used. And we will defend you on this. It is not right. It should not happen. But also, you've made your bed. You're going to have to lay in it, I think, at this stage. But hopefully we will see, next election will bring change.
But I'm not against your right to protest. Indeed, I've defended it. I am against you gluing yourself to the road because that's called criminal damage. So there is always a balance within the law, what is legitimate protest and what is illegitimate. It's a question of where you draw the line, surely.
Certainly, and we're going to hold. We held ourselves accountable for every action that we take. I've been into court many times. My partner was just sent to prison today, again without trial, which is happening quite frequently in the UK. Groups like Just Stop Oil and all these other groups are not going to stop what we're doing, no matter what the government says to us. They need to come to the negotiation table. They need to recognise that the people of Britain want change, and saying that it's extremist to ask for that change will not stop people from asking for it.
And you must be entitled to argue for your cause, even if other people disagree with it. And, I've often said to you, you should stand for election and put it to voters to see if they want your policies, which I think are extreme but not extremist, if you follow me in terms of the difference.
I think I understand what you mean. Yeah, well, I would say, again, politicians are seeing there's changes coming. You know, we are having more and more MPs that are saying they agree with our demands of ending new oil and gas. Although Labour have reneged on some of their demands, they are still saying that new licences will not be part of their policies going forward. We are seeing that the Tories are going to be thrown out in the next general election whenever Rishi decides to have it.
Well, we'll see about that. Time will tell. Nigel, Hope Not Hate coming out and saying that a whole slew of Conservative MPs are being exposed essentially as fascists. That's what underpins them.
That's not what it said.
Well, it lists them in their whole cause is that they're there to expose fascists.
Well, what it describes you as is radical right. I don't know if you would actually go along with it with that description.
No, I'm part of the mainstream of the Conservative Party. Okay. I'm an elected member of Parliament because their whole campaign is implying that people on the right are involved in hate. There is no evidence that members of the Tory party in Parliament are involved with hate. Well, it's a very extreme view.
I mean, what Hope Not Hate... I mean, I don't agree with a lot of what they say. I don't agree with a lot of their conspiracy theories. They have done some really good work. I mean, their main focus is to expose the far left extremists, and that's their basic target. What they were arguing was that people like you are taking the mainstream towards the right. Now, as I say, I don't back that particular argument, but when you've got an organisation that prevented an MP, Rosie Cooper, from being murdered by neo-Nazis, that shows the kind of good work that they have been doing.
And that went to court, and the security services protected Rosie Cooper from that. But it's mentioning people like me in the same list as people who are neo-Nazis. I mean, that's pretty ridiculous, seems to me.
You're mentioning the same document. I don't think that they call the neo-Nazis the fascist fringe, so they do distinguish between the radical right, which they label you as, and the fascist fringe, which are the neo-Nazis.
I think it's very dodgy that a group like this gets government funding, Paul.
Look, it's a perfectly sensible thing to have organisations that are monitoring far-right activity, far-left activity, Islamist activity. That's all absolutely fine. But I think Hope Not Hate are just not doing themselves any favours or doing what they're meant to do any favours if they start dragging in and seeking to delegitimise views that are within the democratic mainstream, even if you disagree with them, like you, or even, say, Nigel Farage, and putting them in the same bracket as neo-Nazis. It doesn't do the debate any good, and is actually devaluing the contribution they themselves could make.
And saying that we're blurring the lines between the radical right and fascists, which seems to be an extraordinary view.
They are blurring the lines between what is legitimate to criticise, in my view, and what's part of the mainstream, even if you don't like it.
And to come back to Michael Gove's definition of this morning, does that stop the government interacting with people who have legitimate views? I mean, that is to say, would it be legitimate to want the caliphate to take place in the UK if you could persuade British people to vote for it?
It's very important to go back to the origins of all this. I mean, this debate about extremism isn't new, and the government for years has had this debate over another group that wasn't named today, the Muslim Council of Britain. You know, do you give it a platform? Do you provide it with government patronage? Do you fund it? They've been having that debate. This just doesn't apply to Just Stop Oil at all, because the government's never patronised it, the government's never given it money, and the government's never given it a platform. So I feel myself that the government's got a bit of explaining to do. You know, I understand not wanting to engage or fund groups that seek to overthrow parliamentary democracy. When you get onto part one of the definition, which is all about ideas and values, that seems to me a muddle, and I'm not quite clear what the government's thinking of here.
Because, Nigel, we're not all obliged to have the same values, are we?
No, that's the point. I mean, and I'm quite pleased to see from the old prevent definition the idea about undermining British values disappearing, simply because it's so vague. I'm in favour of British values, but they mean different things to different people. This is certainly more specific, but I think Paul's right. It rather depends how it's actually exercised, because it's going to be a subjective judgment on groups, not an objective one. And Michael Gove oddly mentioned things like Patriotic Alternative, a neo-Nazi group, which obviously doesn't get government funding.
What worries me is that when I was in the Cabinet Office, we heard that a sort of semi-terrorist supporting group had gone into the Home Office. So we drew up regulations to try and stop groups like that going into the government. Then we discovered that civil service had interpreted this to stop an expert on whatever field he was in who didn't like Brexit going in. And this is the problem. The rules go from something perfectly sensible, and this, Sean, is, I think, where you're concerned, to stopping people having a legitimate cause.
I think this is very much the point, and this is why I would say to you, Jacob, like, if this is a concern you have, oddly enough, we do share it. But will you support a call for citizens' assemblies so things like this cannot happen? MPs cannot go way past the mark and do ridiculous things like this without ratification by the people.
They do that through Parliament, because the great Citizens' Assembly is the House of Commons.
It's signed in today.
We asked Hope Not Hate to appear tonight, but they refused and have not given a statement either. We also asked Trust for London for clarification on its funding of Hope Not Hate, but did not receive a response. Later, I'll be getting to the bottom of whether it was right for the Speaker not to choose Diane Abbott to speak yesterday at Prime Minister's Questions, and I'll be assessing what my next guest has called the implosion of Tories in State of the Nation's book club.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Absenteeism and parents whose children miss a week or more of school face increased fines in a government drive to tackle absence.
This is another one of those government policies which has done nothing to improve the education of our children. In fact, since this was originally introduced some 10 years ago, the educational standards for our children, the 11-year-olds who can't read when they go up to primary school, have got worse and worse and worse. So it's not working. So what do? They just increase the fine. Like, that may make it work. Most of the parents who get fined are taking their kids out so they can take them on a holiday before the holiday companies push the prices up. And frankly, as a parent, if I've got a £600 discount on my holiday versus a £60 fine, I'm going to go for the £60
You'll suffer
fine.
the fine.
Yeah.
Let's not forget the other huge absence that children had recently during COVID. Schools were closed for months and months on end. Online learning was really not making up for that. So how can, it's very difficult for the government to say it was fine for us to take your kids out of school for months, but if you take them off for a few days to go to Disneyland, then you are the worst parent ever and you should be...
But also, it's the pandemic that caused some of the problems with absenteeism now.
Absolutely.
Because the mental health issues that some of these children now have.
And there are tens of thousands of children, they call them ghost children, that have simply disappeared from the school register. So it would be nice... It's really, really scary situation. I'm not saying that the government is, taking great measures.
Well, I think one of their plans is to have a national register, which would help with that.
Which would definitely help. But I think they can't deal with the real problem, so they're going after actually perfectly, decent parents who are just taking the odd day off, to save money, frankly.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
From 10 a.m. every Saturday, we want to make you think and we want to make you laugh.
So we will give you all the top stories.
Now we start with a story that has shocked the nation this week.
But we're also going to make it light and fun and bring some entertainment in to make your Saturday morning nice and restful.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Well, welcome back. We've been talking about extremism, and John makes the very good point. As far as I'm concerned, this organisation should be called Hate, not Hope. Graham, those considered far-right are simply normal people who can think critically. That the floor has moved beneath their feet does not make them extreme right-wingers. And Mick, the government is racing down a blind alley in trying to define extremism. The police simply need to enforce the law as it stands. They are failing to do so, and the government is tripping over itself when it should be demanding that the police does its job properly. Speculation has been rife recently that an election could be called on the 2nd of May, the day of the local elections. In the last few hours, however, the Prime Minister has ruled out an election on that date, which has been taken as a strong indication that it will not now be an early election. Well, my panel is still with me, Paul Goodman and Nigel Nelson. Paul, this has been a completely unnecessary distraction, hasn't it?
Well, there are two great games that political journalists play. Game number one is, when will the Tory leadership challenge be? And game number two is, when will the general election be? And the truth is, both of these could have been shut down if the 1922 committee had more rational rules about leadership challenge, and if the Prime Minister had only seen through what he started to do in January and rule out a May election, none of this need have happened.
Does ruling out the May election make the other favourite conversation on Tory leadership more topical?
Well, that conversation is rather like rain falling in the British spring. It will go on regardless of when the general election is called or what the particular circumstances of the time are. I mean, my judgment is it makes it marginally less likely, but hey, the media wants to talk about a Tory leadership challenge, so do lots of Conservative MPs, so do some Conservative commentators, so we doubtless will.
We doubtless will. Nigel, you must be watching this with a sort of degree of amusement as the Tory party gets itself into a bit of muddle over dates and so on.
Apart from the damage it's doing to the country, but yes, I mean, to an extent there. I would add one to the journalist list that Paul mentioned, that when we've got nothing else to write about, we reshuffle the cabinet. That's the third one.
Absolutely.
But on the May election, I think that he had it planned. I think he had it planned towards the end of last year. That was the idea. But certain things had to fall into place. One is that the National Insurance cut worked, that the recent budget had to change the polls around, and we had a plane off to Rwanda. None of those things have happened, so I think that the polls haven't changed at all. They're just getting worse, and he's now in the stage of, let's just hope something turns up and we get away with it.
But this is very much the Labour Party's narrative, isn't it? The Labour Party wants to imply, and has been doing a lot of briefing, saying that they think it's going to be May, and telling Labour candidates that they've got to have their election addresses in by midnight on whatever day it is, but pretty soon, to try and beef up the heat around the 2nd of May to then say, you're for it.
That's right. I mean, Labour have certainly been pumping this up for the last month, and ironically, at the point when it seemed less likely, it was not going to... The budget, I think, was the final nail in the coffin. It hasn't moved the dial, and so because of that, it just became so much less likely that he could go on May the 2nd. The question really is, when does he go? I mean, will things get better for him? All he can pray is that he's done enough to get rid of Labour's economic policy. We may end up in a situation which one is better than the other, and as simple as that.
And there's a golden rule of British politics, isn't there, that has certainly held true since 1979, that governments go after 4 years, if everything's going well and they're comfortably ahead in the polls, that's the time to do it.
Yes, but it often doesn't happen, and this is a case now. I've never thought it would be May or the spring, just because the Conservatives are about 20 points behind, and hey, Prime Ministers don't go to the polls when they're 20 points behind. I mean, I suppose really what will happen, I suppose, is broadly one of two things. The first thing is, to be frank, people have looked at the Conservatives, they've seen them have 4 terms, and they've just given up. They want change. That's possibility number one, probably the most likely. The other, which I suppose is Rishi Sunak's hope, is that when the campaign actually starts, people will become more politically engaged than they are now. But clearly there's no great affection for Keir Starmer. It doesn't really look as though Labour's got much room for manoeuvre, and people will have second thoughts, and that's the nature of the choice.
And does this put pressure on for the 3rd of May, when the election results have come in, on the leadership question? Or do you share my view that another change in leadership would be absolute madness?
Well, the 2 points you've made are not contradictory. Yes, of course, there'll be immense turmoil after the local elections in May. But you really have to ask what another change of Conservative leader is actually going to do. Who is this magical person who's going to unite the Conservative Party?
Well, Penny Mordaunt seems to be putting herself forward as far as the newspapers are concerned.
Well, I can't, with all due respect to Penny Mordaunt or Kemi Badenoch or any of these potential contenders, I mean, why on earth should the voters accept now a 3rd Conservative leader who has had no endorsement from the voters? Once maybe fine, twice, possibly, third time, no.
So as a final point, if we had another leader, we'd have to go straight to an election.
Yes.
We couldn't then hold on.
There is no question about it. It would have to be a general election, yeah.
So something of a stir has arisen after Prime Minister's questions yesterday, when in spite of Diane Abbott's reported 46 bobs in the chamber, a way of signalling one's intent to ask a question, the Speaker didn't select her. It's been more widely suggested that this was a disappointing decision from Mr Speaker, considering the unpleasant remarks made about her by the Tory donor Frank Hester. However, context is missing from this. Prime Minister's questions is half an hour, and the Speaker has to get through the entire order paper, including 6 questions from the Leader of the Opposition and 2 for the SNP Commons leader. If people have a problem with the way things unfolded yesterday, it's a procedural matter rather than the Speaker doing anything wrong. Well, my commentators are still with me. Paul, you know procedure in the House of Commons. The draw is done every week, and yesterday's draw had almost overwhelmingly opposition people. I think it was 11 opposition, 4 Conservative. The Speaker didn't get through all the people on the paper by past, let alone getting on to opposition people who weren't on the list.
I suppose just to put the other point of view for a moment, I think some of your viewers will think, well, hey, you know, Diane Abbott's been named this week. Why shouldn't she get up? And let's sweep aside all these anachronistic rules and regulations that prevent her being called. And I suppose the answer to that is, you know, rather as you've got to have rules in a school to keep order, you've got to have rules in the House of Commons. If a Labour MP is down on the order paper to be called, you can't just push that person aside to put someone else.
And people only expect to get in twice a year, so being called at Prime Minister's questions is a big thing if you're on the order paper. You don't want to lose your spot in the sun.
No, I understand that totally. And if after the shuffle, as you guys call it, took place and you had a full list, it was going to be very difficult for the Speaker to do anything about it. I just think in a case like this, where almost the entire of Prime Minister's questions was about Diane Abbott, it seems particularly sad that Diane Abbott didn't have a chance to question the Prime Minister when the whole debate was about her.
But there is one thing that you can do as a backbench MP, and that is raise a point of order, which the Speaker would unquestionably have taken at the end of PMQs when the Prime Minister is still there.
If the Prime Minister is still there.
But if you're fleet of foot, the Prime Minister is still there, and the Speaker would have been perfectly happy to take a point of order. That's the thing with House of Commons procedures. There's always a way, but the backbencher has to be willing to use the way to get his or her point across.
I think the Prime Minister might have done a runner before that she got to her feet.
But the Speaker was criticised a fortnight ago for changing Commons procedures.
Which is why I understand why he couldn't do it this time round.
And everyone said, well, you shouldn't do that. Therefore, he has to stick to procedures. If people don't like it, the Procedure Committee can make alternative suggestions.
I'm just imagining a world in which Diane Abbott would have got to her feet and said, point of order, Mr Speaker, just before the Prime Minister scurries out of the chamber, which is, in fact, I suspect, what would have been happening. May I make the point that
Prime Ministers look very weak if they scurry out when they know there's a point about to be made about them, and they carefully orchestrate things to stop looking weak.
Lesser of two evils, though, in a situation like that. And the last thing he wants to do is be questioned by Diane Abbott, so one can understand that.
Well, he wouldn't have had to respond, but he would have been there. I'd been very surprised if he'd scurried out, because I don't think he's a cowardly man.
OK, well, I mean, I've seen Prime Minister scurry out at a pretty rapid rate where there are things coming up they don't want to do.
We'll never know. We'll never know, but I think the Speaker did the right thing and stuck to the rules. Thank you to my panel. I'll be explaining shortly why returning wolves to the wild in Britain could be one of the most gloriously potty ideas I've heard in a long time. Plus, one of Britain's foremost political journalists joins for State of the Nation's book club.
Good evening. Welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Tomorrow will be a case of dodging the downpours, some pretty heavy ones around, but also some bright spells. When low pressure is dominating, sitting right over the UK, you're never going to have dry weather for long. But this low has been providing some very soggy conditions through central and southern Scotland through the day, and it stays wet overnight here. Showers elsewhere, becoming a bit drier for England and Wales through the night, but then more heavy downpours coming from the southwest through the early hours. Gusty winds with that as well, maybe even the odd rumble of thunder that might wake you up. A very mild night for most, but just low enough for a touch of frost in northern Scotland in the countryside. So a damp and chilly start for most of Scotland. Further heavy showers further south, a lot of spray and surface water on the roads for the morning commute. Those downpours should ease through the day, but it stays dull and damp for southeast Scotland, northeast England. Elsewhere, a mixture of bright spells, but also some further showers. Again, pretty mild for England and Wales, 15, 16, where we see some sunshine, but a cold feeling day, particularly with that persistent rain over Scotland. Gets pretty cold on Friday night. Many of us will start the weekend with a touch of frost, but also, many of us will start with some sunshine. Stays fine for much of eastern England, northern England and Scotland. Further west, cloud will be edging in with some patchy rain. Temperatures in the teens in the south, single figures once more further north, despite some decent spells of sunshine. Goodbye.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Welcome back. We were talking about Mr. Speaker and Diane Abbott, and you've been sending in your mail mogs. Martin says, is it any wonder the polls have not improved after the useless budget? 2% off NI, telling the public they are £900 a year better off. Most people won't be £900 better off, as they state the average wage rather than the lower median wage. And Anne says, Jacob, what do you think about Angela Rayner suggesting Diane Abbott should be allowed back in to the party? Well, they might want to after all that's gone on this week. She is, of course, an independent at the moment, not a Labour Member of Parliament. For some time now, there has been a movement in Britain to return wolves to the wild in the UK, and footage emerging from Lincolnshire of deer holding up traffic has once again reignited the wolf lobby. Indeed, you could say they're howling. Wolves were once part of the British ecosystem until they were hunted to extinction, really by the time of the reign of Henry VII in 1485. A few continued into the 18th century, a great century, of which I'm sometimes said to be the member for. But I can't think of a more splendidly eccentric idea than returning wolves to the wild, not least because it poses a nightmare for farmers and, of course, the three little pigs.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Big bad wolf, big bad wolf. Who's afraid of the big bad wolf?
Is that really what we want in rural Somerset, where we both actually live?
I mean, it's funny that you should show Three Little Pigs, because it's pig farmers on the continent that are most happy about the return of wolves, because, of course, African swine fever is a real threat for pig farming, and it's only in those places where wolves are present that wild boar, which carry the disease, are under control.
So it kills the boars?
It kills the weaker boar, it kills the sick
right.
ones.
But then it doesn't get the three little pigs. They don't jump over into the sties and gobble up all of the pigs at once.
I mean, look, the idea of having wolves back in Britain is considered mad. I don't think it's quite as mad as people will have us believe. I mean, anyone who's been on holiday in the continent in the last year or two, in France, let's say, or Belgium, or Italy, or Spain, has been in a landscape populated by wolves, and lots of them. I mean, there are 4,000 or 5,000 wolves in Italy.
But aren't they generally less densely populated countries, and that the UK is pretty densely populated? And you've seen lots of foxes coming into London. Do they then come into London once they've exhausted the food supply in the countryside?
Well, of course, the Netherlands is as densely populated or more than we are.
I think.
And certainly one of the most intensively managed landscapes in Europe. I think the Netherlands is 2 or 3 in the league tables in terms of food exporting nations. And there are more wolves in the Netherlands than you'll find in Norway. So there are wolves in Luxembourg, in Belgium, and in cities, Rome, Amsterdam, Paris, Madrid. They've all got wolves. But I don't think we should play down the difficulties of living alongside charismatic wildlife like wolves. It is a difficult thing. They don't pose a threat to humans, but they do pose a threat to some livestock, especially sheep.
Especially sheep. And, I mean, in rural Somerset, you have lots of sheep that aren't particularly protected. They're protected by dry stone walls or hedges, and the wolves could easily get over that. Are wolves like foxes in that they won't just kill one, they'll kill as many as they can?
So they'll kill livestock and they'll kill them in numbers. So they do that in the same way that foxes will go into a chicken shed and kill more than they need. No one quite understands why they do that. But coexistence is possible. I mean, Belgium, for example, has invested heavily in coexistence measures. And in the last year, while wolf numbers have gone up, they've halved the numbers of livestock killed by wolves.
How have they done that?
So a whole range of different techniques, special sounds, and experimenting with pheromone smells that drive wolves away, little flapping bits of plastic around the fencing, dogs, alpacas, donkeys. They're trying everything. And the EU, to give it credit, is really investing in that coexistence. But the numbers of livestock killed are not as big as people will have you believe. So in France, for example, where there are many sheep, millions, and where there are many wolves, the number of sheep killed amount to about 0.02% of all the sheep in France each year.
And in terms of the wolves breeding, how many would you expect to get if they were left free? I mean, would you get in the position where you might have to cull wolves if the reintroduction was successful?
So I'm no scientist, but carnivore scientists say that humans do not need to manage the numbers of apex predators. They are self-regulating. So American scientists will say that you don't need to harvest or manage wolves or cougars. They are self-regulating. I think there's a sort of birthright thing here. Aside from the practicalities of managing explosive numbers of deer, especially in our croplands. 85% of the food that we produce in this country comes from Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire, the East, places that are overrun with deer, and hunters are not on top of it and won't get on top of it. So aside from the practicalities, I think that there's a moral or a birthright argument for putting back these missing species. Look how delighted people are that white storks are back in Sussex or beavers are back in the rivers of the West Country.
Yes, absolutely, but they're harmless, and perhaps... Oh, you can tell that I've got lots of little children, which is why I know the Big Bad Wolf cartoons so well, but perhaps they're less frightening than wolves. But there's another story to talk about whilst you're here, Ben, and that's the fact the EU has seemingly come to its senses at last on the question of green farming rules. The unelected, unaccountable European Commission seems to have listened to voters and is set to take the decision to slash environmental requirements for its farmers amidst months of backlash from farmers across the country. So it's rare that I praise the European Union, but surely making it easier and cheaper for our own farmers to produce food is a sensible way to enable competitiveness. That this is a really important decision, isn't it? Because European farming was becoming less and less competitive. And the EU has now, I think, basically said it will lift almost all regulations on farmers of under 25 acres, which is the majority of farmers in receipt of subsidies in Europe.
So what's in the sights of the European Commission are not so much the regulations governing farming as the green conditions attached to the subsidies which are provided to farming. And I don't believe in subsidies long-term for any industry. The EU gives out 55 to 60 billion euros a year to farming. And then there are some conditions historically attached to that, cross-compliance around environmental stewardship. Now, I think public money should be used to deliver public goods, and I would be in favour of removing subsidies, really, and replacing them with payments for things that we need. So, for example, if a cluster of farmers is shown to be helping to reduce flooding, and thereby protecting communities from floodwater, they should be rewarded by the state for doing that. But just dishing out cash according to how much land you're farming is a madness in my mind, and one of the best Brexit dividends that we could have possibly conceived of as environmentalists is an end to those mad subsidies.
Well, I completely agree with you, and the fact that there are so many 25-acre farms subsidised in the continent shows why EU farming is so inefficient, because they have propped up farms that ought to have consolidated, as has mainly happened in the UK, and farming can be, as the Dutch show, can be globally competitive if you concentrate it and you adopt to commercial activities.
Yes, but the European Union's farm subsidies, about 50% of them are given out to the 10% richest farmers. So actually it's overwhelmingly the largest. And I think what happens when you subsidise an industry for 40 years with billions and billions of euros is you kill any desire for innovation, any willingness to innovate. So I think European and British farming has become stagnant. And change was always a constant in the British landscape. If you'd taken the train across Kent in the pre-war years, you'd have found lots of hops. Then we went to apples. Now we're going to white wine. Innovation has always been something that's present in the British landscape, and subsidies have killed that off.
And it's absolutely amazing in Somerset how you see farmers who are doing incredibly well because they're innovating and they're doing value-added things. I mean, there's a farmer very near me who has his own dairy. He sells the milk locally. It sells at a premium price. He's got on the site somebody making mozzarella, of all things, to be made in Somerset. And that innovation is really what makes us competitive, not subsidies. So on the issue of cutting subsidies, I'm sure you're right.
Yeah, but and I think Michael Gove was so brilliant when he was in DEFRA because he replaced subsidies with a system known as public money for public good or environmental land management. And it's that each payment is directly linked to the public goods that are delivered. And I think that where those public goods are quantifiable in their benefit for society, I think it's quite right that the state should pay for them.
There are some difficulties with that. I agree with your point on flooding. It's been more difficult with some of the process of taking land out of agriculture because that's damaged the tenant farmer who hasn't been able to innovate agriculturally and has been a great boon for the landowner who probably doesn't need it.
Yeah, I think that the most effective landscape recovery programs, which are typically geared towards much less productive landscapes, typically in our national parks, are the ones that have been designed in conjunction with tenants. And there are some brilliant ones out there. And I think some of these tests and trials that have taken place have shown that is possible. You know, I don't think landscape recovery needs to be at odds with the rights of tenants. And I haven't seen anyone suggest that we should be taking good productive land out of production. No one wants to rewild Cambridgeshire, for example. Now, in those places, the challenge, as far as food security goes, is getting the land under production for food for people rather than for machines. I mean, bioenergy, for example, uses up 300,000 acres of our best...
Bioenergy is a terrible idea. Well, I'm not sure I want wolves in West Harptree. But actually, there's a lot of agreement between us. Thank you, Ben, very much indeed. Coming up, State of the Nation Book Club returns with the Telegraph's political editor, Ben Riley-Smith, to discuss the right to rule, 13 years, 5 prime ministers, and the implosion of the Tories.
On Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m. Michael Gove's new definition of extremism is out, but who's slipped through the net? I'll face off against a lineup of these potential new extremists. The Home Office have accepted a migrant argument that Israel is an apartheid state. Have we just opened the door for nearly 2 million Palestinians to come to Britain? Plus, Nigel Farage tells me if the Boris Johnson bubble has burst, and huge divisions in the Labour Party. Angela Rayner wants Diane Abbott back in. It's Patrick Christie's tonight, 9 till 11 p.m. Be there.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
President versus the Prince. Wow, what a story, Jenny. And this basically could mean Donald Trump rummaging around in these allegations in Spare about Prince Harry's drug taking, and it may affect his future residency plans. And of course, lest we forget, Meghan was very outspoken of her disdain for Trump when he was voted in. Jenny, this story really gets the juices flowing.
Yes. Well, Donald Trump, I think most people would accept, is probably quite a vindictive man. And he is a law unto himself. And he's made it very clear that he regards Harry and Meghan as being completely on their own if he becomes president. Thus far, they've been somewhat, I suppose, protected by the Biden administration. There is a group, a conservative group, who are trying to force the publication of the application that Harry filled in for his visa when he moved to America. And you know, the rules and laws on drug taking are quite intense over there. And the question is, did Harry say, as he did in his book Spare, that he had taken quite a considerable number of drugs? Did he say that on his visa application? But Trump has made a lot of quite unpleasant noises saying that he'll be on his own and it could threaten his residency in the United States.
California, the public enemy number one of Donald Trump, actually make the Sussexers more popular.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Martin. I think so. You know, they will be seen as victims of Trump, and their liberal credentials will be feted and celebrated, as they are already, I suppose, in California. So they could become new heroes and heroine of modern-day politics. So we will have to wait and see. But Trump has definitely got it in for.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
Well, welcome back. We've been discussing wolves and EU agricultural policy, and you've been sending in your mail mogs. Elizabeth says they want to bring back wolves to stop us eating lamb, or they'll all be eaten by the wolves. And Jacob, we've had mass migration for 2 decades, multiculturalism has failed, and the red squirrel is gone. Britain is full. We have no room for wolves. Well, I didn't think the wolves were coming over on the small boats, but perhaps they are. And Alex, as a Wolves fan, and I think that's an association football team, I think the return of the best football team in the Midlands would be a wonderful thing. Excellent. I'm delighted to hear it. The new book, The Right to Rule, 13 years, 5 prime ministers and the implosion of the Tories, is an explosive but erudite account of Westminster's intrigue over the last decade and a bit. From the ashes of the financial crisis to Brexit and the global pandemic, Ben had a front-row seat. State of the Nation Book Club starts now. Well, I'm joined now by Ben Riley-Smith, the political editor of the Daily Telegraph. Ben, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
I've much enjoyed reading your book.
Brilliant.
Some of which I was around for. And one of the great unknowns is the 2017 election, which Theresa May calls the famous walk in the hills that she did and came back and called an election, having said she wouldn't.
Yeah.
And then she didn't win it. What effect do you think that had?
Oh, a huge effect. I think it's so easy when we consider Theresa May's legacy now. We remember that Brexit crunch in Parliament, the inability to get anything through the House of Commons and how much that ultimately undercut her premiership and led to her being forced out. What we don't remember is that first year when she was miles ahead in the polls. She was seen as kind of cleaning up the mess of the posh boys, the sensible, sincere, hard-working Theresa May. And when she called that snap election, she was roughly as far ahead of Labour, the Tories as far ahead of Labour, as Labour are now, kind of 20 points. So it was there to win a bigger majority, and that would have given her the space in the Commons to get through her version of Brexit.
And what would her version have been, do you think?
Well, that's a fascinating question. In one of the chapters, we explore those early months and plot out just how influential Nick Timothy, who's now running to be one of your colleagues on the Tory benches, was in her camp. Remember, Theresa May was a Remainer, Nick Timothy was a Brexiteer. There was that big speech in the conference of 2016 where Theresa May had to project to Brexiteers like yourself that she could be trusted with Brexit, and Nick Timothy played a huge part in shaping that narrative, and ultimately it was quite a hard version of Brexit that she espoused in that speech, saying, no, we're not going to be in the single market or the customs union, no, EU judges aren't going to be involved. So the question is whether if she'd won extra space, she would have continued with that hard Brexit, whether she would have actually pivoted to a softer one.
Because the prominence of the ERG and of the One Nation group really comes about because she's got no majority.
Yeah.
We would have been marginal figures if she'd had a majority of 100 that it looked as if she was going to get when she called the election.
Politics is a numbers game, and he who holds the balance holds the power. And why the ERG was so powerful in that period after the 2017 election, when Theresa May lost her Commons majority and had to do a deal with the DUP, was they had the numbers. And ultimately, the Spartans held steadfast and didn't want to back her deal. But you're right, if she had had 50, 60, 70, 80 MP majority, then she would have been fine.
And one of the things that runs through the book is this 15%. You say that David Cameron thought about 15% every day he was leader of the party, and it's led to there being 5 prime ministers, whilst Labour couldn't get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, even when a huge percentage of his party, over 60%, voted against him. How destabilising do you think the 15% is? And do you think David Cameron would have been removed had he not gone after losing the referendum?
Well, in this book that covers this period of 13 years plus, I think you can see politically the strengths and the weaknesses of that 15%. You know, Boris Johnson, Theresa May was ultimately toppled because Tory MPs didn't want her. They triggered that 15% threshold.
You're quite generous in passing about our efforts to get the letters in, which seemed much more embarrassing a failure at the time than you made it sound in the book.
The reference to Dad's Army, because I think you and others went public and said, we want these no confidence letters in, and for a week or so...
Nothing happened.
Nothing happened, So arguably politically that worked. You got rid of Theresa May, got Boris Johnson, secured this big majority, drove through the policy of Brexit. But then arguably what happened 2 years ago, when that happened with Boris and then it happened so quickly with Liz again, showed that almost kind of itchy trigger finger. It was so easy to get rid of leaders that it became a habit, and the public clearly became disillusioned with that, and the Tories are still trying to recover.
And indeed, and they got fed up with it at the point at which Boris went, and the polls have never recovered from then. It's a very interesting comment you have from Kwasi Kwarteng on the Liz Truss experience. If it hadn't been the mini-budget, it would have been something else.
Yes.
Is that the view you came to when you were writing it? Because until she became Prime Minister, she'd been a very good tactical politician and had managed to survive all sorts of shape-shifting within the Tory party.
I think the truth about her, often you hear in politics people saying, why aren't politicians conviction politicians? Actually, Liz Truss was probably more of a conviction politician than the common assessment put it. But yeah, there was this problem. One of her former speechwriters called it the spinal tap problem. She'd always turn everything up to 11. And when you're a cabinet minister, that works quite well in negotiations because you ultimately get bartered down by the civil service or by other cabinet ministers. When you're prime minister, there is no one there telling you, no, turn it back down. So if you have this instinct for going big and you don't have the checks and balances on your power, then as Kwasi Kwarteng said, and quite a few of other people in that inner circle said, it was going to be something else that she would have gone too big on.
Yes, though actually the civil service deserves some credit because you discuss the setting of the gas price for a long period. The civil service negotiator, who I worked very closely with, was absolutely brilliant and was quite determined we were not going to settle at a lunatic price costing billions of pounds. And there was certainly an element of making sure things didn't happen too quickly and we didn't get a ridiculous price.
Yes, but in that, did you feel that Liz Truss was pushing for a big deal? Because, you know, as we describe in the book from others, you know, they wanted a big 2 decades deal that was going to be tens of billions of pounds. That could be an admirable drive.
There was certainly some talk around that. That is certainly true. And now we've got Rishi Sunak.
Yes.
Of course, he's still in place as your book ends. Where do you think it goes next?
Well, ultimately, to the election, and can there be a miracle turnaround? I mean, what is true, certainly looking back from where we are, is there have been so many points as journalists when we look forward and say, well, maybe that is the point when things begin to turn. The autumn statement, this net zero reset, last autumn's conference speech, this month's budget, and yet the polls have remained doggedly at about 20 points with Labour ahead. So you do begin to wonder, what if it hasn't happened yet will trigger that turnaround?
Yes, as Theresa May once famously said, nothing has changed. Ben, thank you very much indeed. That's all from me. Up next, it's Patrick Christys. Patrick, what is on your bill of fare this evening?
Yeah, absolutely. Massive show. It appears that the Home Office seems willing to let around 2 million Palestinians come and claim asylum in the UK, which I think is rather frightening news. Angela Rayner blows the Labour Party apart. Diane Abbott thinks everyone's a racist, and Nigel Farage is teeing off on Boris Johnson. 9 till 11 p.m. I'll have all of tomorrow's newspaper front pages for you today as well. And I've got a rock star panel this evening. Alison Pearson, Sean Bailey and Matthew Larser.
Well, that, as always, sounds absolutely excellent, and I wonder whether the Home Office will give them all £3,000 when they've come here illegally to go to Rwanda. That's coming up after the weather. I'll be back on Monday at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and I shall shortly be motoring down to Somerset, and I'm looking forward to heading there as the weather improves incrementally, mile by mile, furlong by furlong, until finally I reach those broad, sunlit uplands that are known as God's own county of Somersetshire, where King Alfred, of course, worked out how to defeat the Danes.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening. Welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office for GB News. Tomorrow will be a case of dodging the downpours, some pretty heavy ones around, but also some bright spells. When low pressure is dominating, sitting right over the UK, you're never going to have dry weather for long. But this low has been providing some very soggy conditions through central and southern Scotland through the day, and it stays wet overnight here. Showers elsewhere, becoming a bit drier for England and Wales through the night, but then more heavy downpours coming from the southwest through the early hours. Gusty winds with that as well, maybe even the odd rumble of thunder that might wake you up. A very mild night for most, but just low enough for a touch of frost in northern Scotland in the countryside. So a damp and chilly start for most of Scotland. Further heavy showers further south, a lot of spray and surface water on the roads for the morning commute. Those downpours should ease through the day, but it stays dull and damp for southeast Scotland, northeast England. Elsewhere, a mixture of bright spells, but also some further showers. Again, pretty mild for England and Wales, 15, 16, where we see some sunshine, but a cold-feeling day, particularly with that persistent rain over Scotland. Gets pretty cold on Friday night. Many of us will start the weekend with a touch of frost, but also many of us will start with some sunshine. Stays fine for much of eastern England, northern England and Scotland. Further west, cloud will be edging in with some patchy rain. Temperatures in the teens in the south, single figures once more further north, despite some decent spells of sunshine. Goodbye.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
We've got cash, treats and a spring shopping spree to be won in a great British giveaway. You could win an amazing £12,345 in tax-free cash. Plus, there's a further £500 of shopping vouchers to spend at your favourite store. We'll also give you a gadget package to use in your garden this spring. That includes a games console, a pizza oven and a portable smart speaker, so you can listen to GB News on the go. For another chance to win the vouchers, the treats and £12,345 in tax-free cash, text GBWIN to 84902. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or post your name and number to GB03 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on Friday the 29th of March. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if watching or listening on demand. Good luck.
I'm Martin Daubney. This is GB News, Britain's news channel. Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel. 2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's